The Saturday morning had dawned with the kind of perfection that only Colorado Springs could offer. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber as watched her 3-year-old daughter, Emma, chase butterflies near the sandbox at Riverside Park in downtown Denver. It was 10:47 a.m., a time would later remember with haunting clarity, the exact moment before her world tilted on its axis. The park was moderately busy, filled with the usual weekend crowd, young families with strollers, teenagers playing frisbee on the open lawn, and elderly couples taking their morning walks. Emma wore her favorite sundress, the yellow one with tiny daisies that had bought her for her 3rd birthday just 3 months ago. The child's laughter echoed across the open space, pure and uninhibited, the kind of sound that made every parent in the vicinity smile. Sat on a wooden bench near the playground, her eyes never leaving her daughter even as she sipped her lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. She was a careful mother, perhaps overly so. Some of the other parents joked about her constant vigilance, the way she counted heads every few minutes, the way she knew exactly where Emma was at all times, but had her reasons. Emma's older brother, Jacob, had had a scare at age 2 when he'd wandered too close to a retention pond. That experience had shaped parenting philosophy. Constant awareness was not paranoia, it was responsibility. Her husband was at home working on a freelance project. He was an architect, and this morning outing was chance to give Emma some quality playtime before the week's chaos resumed. In the distance, approximately 200 yards from where Emma played, something was happening that nobody in the park had anticipated. Officer, a 17-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, was conducting a routine K-9 unit training exercise in the designated police training area at the park's perimeter. The area was technically closed to the public, marked with orange cones and official signage, but the barriers between the training zone and the main park area were minimal. A simple chain-link fence that had been repaired 3 times in the past 18 months. Officer had been working with Duke, a 215-pound German Shepherd, for 5 years. Duke was what the department called exemplary perfect behavioral records, never a single incident of aggression toward humans, and an impeccable nose for detecting narcotics. The dog had been involved in over 200 successful drug busts and had been commended multiple times for his service to the Denver community. That morning had arrived at the park at 9:30 a.m. with Duke and 2 other K-9 officers, Captain Robert Williams and Officer Lisa Torres. They were conducting what they called a public environment desensitization exercise, essentially training the dogs to remain focused on their handlers and their tasks even when distractions occurred around them. It was important training, designed to ensure that K-9 units could function effectively in real-world scenarios where chaos, noise, and unexpected events were inevitable. Duke had been performing flawlessly. He'd navigated through simulated crowd scenarios, remained focused despite loud noises from a portable speaker, and had executed every command had given him without hesitation. The dog was in a state of heightened alertness, his muscles coiled like springs, his entire being attuned to his commands and presence. At approximately 10:50 a.m., just as was preparing Duke for the final exercise of the morning, a mock tracking scenario, something unexpected occurred. A child from the adjacent playground, a boy who looked to be about 8 years old, had wandered toward the chain-link fence separating the training area from the park. The boy wasn't causing any real trouble. He was simply curious, watching the impressive dog perform its training exercises. But to Duke, trained to detect anomalies and respond to environmental changes, this sudden appearance represented a change in the established pattern. The dog's ears perked up. His attention flickered, just for a moment, from his face to the boy at the fence. It was a tiny lapse in focus, barely noticeable to untrained eyes, but it was exactly the kind of real-world distraction that the training session was designed to address. Noticed the lapse immediately and made a split-second decision to call out to the boy, to ask him to move away from the fence. But as he was opening his mouth to speak, something else happened, something that would later be examined frame by frame in slow motion, dissected by experts, and debated across social media for months to come. A woman walking her golden retriever on the far side of the park shouted out loudly, not in distress, but in greeting to a friend. It was a normal, friendly sound, nothing alarming to human ears. But to Duke, whose hearing was 3 times more sensitive than humans, the sudden vocalization combined with the child at the fence created a perfect storm of stimulation. His focus shattered. His prey drive, which had been carefully channeled and controlled through 5 years of professional training, suddenly surged forward. Felt the leash go taut in his hand, but he had made a crucial error just seconds before. He had loosened his grip on the leash slightly as he reached down to adjust Duke's harness, checking the fit to ensure the dog's comfort during the training session. That moment of loosened grip was all it took. Duke lunged forward with explosive power, and the leash slipped through his fingers like a rope through wet hands. The officer shouted commands, sharp, authoritative words that Duke had responded to 1,000 times before. Heel, Duke, heel, down DOWN. But Duke didn't hear them, or perhaps some primal part of his brain had temporarily his training. He was moving now with a single-minded purpose, his massive body covering ground at incredible speed. The other 2 officers in the training area, Captain Williams and Officer Torres, immediately moved to intercept, but they were too far away, and Duke was moving with a speed that belied his massive size. Sprinted after his dog, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind suddenly consumed with a single terrifying thought. The dog was heading directly toward the main playground area. Parents in the park began to notice something was wrong. One mother grabbed her child's hand. A man pointed and shouted a warning. Another father began moving toward the center of the park, instinctively trying to position himself between the dog and the children. But they all felt that sinking sensation of helplessness, that terrible knowledge that sometimes, despite your best efforts, events move faster than your ability to respond. And in that chaos, running in the opposite direction from most of the panicking adults, was 3-year-old Emma. She hadn't heard the shouting. She hadn't seen the loose dog barreling toward her. She was completely absorbed in her pursuit of a particularly brilliant blue butterfly that seemed to dance just beyond her reach, leading her step by step away from the safety of the sandbox and toward the open field where nothing stood between her and an out-of-control 200-pound animal rapidly closing the distance. Saw it first. She saw the dog, she saw Emma, and she saw the terrible geometry of the moment, the lines that were about to intersect with catastrophic results. Her coffee cup fell from her hand, shattering on the ground. She stood up so quickly that her vision blurred, and then she was running, screaming her daughter's name over and over again, her voice raw and desperate. Emma, Emma, come here. Move, baby, move. But 3-year-olds don't respond reliably to panic-stricken commands, and Emma, still focused on her butterfly, took another step forward into the open field. 50 feet away, the German Shepherd was still advancing. Officer was shouting. Parents were screaming. And Emma stood alone in the center of an open field, about to come face to face with a force of nature she had no way of understanding or controlling. The world seemed to slow down in that moment, as if time itself had decided to pause and bear witness to what was about to unfold. Emma was gathering dandelions, plucking them from the grass with the careful precision that only a small child possessed when she first sensed the presence. She didn't hear the dog, not consciously, anyway. Later, when questioned by psychologists and child development experts, Emma would struggle to articulate exactly what had alerted her. It wasn't the thundering of paws on earth. It wasn't the shouting voices or the screams of parents. It was something else entirely, something that existed in that mysterious space between instinct and intuition, between the animal brain that humans carry buried deep beneath their consciousness, and the thinking mind that society had taught her to rely upon. Emma turned slowly, her small body rotating with an almost mechanical precision. In her tiny hand, she still clutched 3 dandelions, their fragile stems bent slightly from her grip. Her yellow sundress rippled in the breeze, and her bare feet, always let her go barefoot in the park on warm days, were planted firmly on the grass. And that's when she saw him. Duke was perhaps 30 feet away now, closing the distance with each powerful stride. His tongue lolled from the side of his mouth. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, the whites showing all around the iris in that particular way that indicates extreme arousal or fear. His muscles rippled beneath his fur with each movement, a symphony of controlled power that would have sent most people running in terror. But Emma did not run. This fact, this single, undeniable fact, would later become the crux of the entire legal case, the focal point around which entire arguments would revolve, and the subject of countless debates among psychologists, animal behaviorists, and legal experts. A normal 3-year-old, confronted with an enormous dog running directly at her, would have exhibited a completely predictable response: fear, panic, flight, or freezing. The American Academy of Pediatrics could have written a textbook chapter on the appropriate responses of a young child to such a scenario, and running away would have been the most common outcome. But Emma did not run. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her small frame unmoving, her body language shifting in a way that would later be analyzed and reanalyzed by experts who marveled at its sophistication. Her shoulders dropped, her chest relaxed, her arms, which had been held slightly away from her body, dropped naturally to her sides. Her head remained level, her gaze locked directly on the approaching dog. And most remarkably, her facial expression shifted from the mild curiosity she'd been displaying moments before to something that resembled, and this was the word that kept recurring in expert testimonies, recognition. As if she were looking at an old friend, someone she had known for a very long time, someone she recognized despite the chaos of their arrival. Officer was 50 feet behind Duke now, his legs pumping as fast as they could move, his voice raw from shouting commands that the dog was completely ignoring. His mind was cycling through a series of terrifying scenarios, each one worse than the last. He'd seen Duke in action during drug busts. He knew what the dog was capable of. He knew the force of those jaws, the power of those muscles, the unpredictability of a dog in a state of prey drive. Everything he knew told him that what was about to happen was going to be catastrophic. His radio was already at his lips, calling for emergency services, for paramedics, for assistance. His voice was high and tight with panic, nothing like his usual calm professional tone. Was closer to Emma than was, but still too far away. She had maybe 10 seconds to cover the 60 feet between her and her daughter, and she was moving faster than she'd ever moved in her life. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed for air. But even in her panic, she knew she wouldn't make it. The geometry was wrong. The distances were all wrong. Duke would reach Emma in approximately 3 seconds and would reach Emma in approximately 7. Those 4 seconds represented an eternity, a gap so large that it might as well have been unbridgeable. The dog was 15 feet from Emma now, close enough that the people watching could see the saliva flying from his mouth, close enough that they could hear the thunder of his breathing, close enough that the outcome seemed inevitable. Voices from across the park raised in pure animal terror, parents screaming, children crying, strangers shouting warnings that had nowhere to go and no effect on the momentum of the moment. Time had not slowed down after all. It was moving at normal speed, but it felt slow because every second contained an eternity of fear. And then Emma spoke. Her voice was small, impossibly, almost comically small given the magnitude of the moment. But it carried with it a quality that seemed to cut through all the chaos, all the noise and fear and panic. It was calm. It was certain. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, which made it all the more remarkable coming from a 3-year-old child. "Hey Duke, it's okay. You're just scared." The words hung in the air like a physical thing, tangible and real. They seemed to reach the dog like an invisible hand, like a rope thrown out into the chaos. And something extraordinary happened. Duke's trajectory changed. Not dramatically, he didn't stop dead or leap to the side, but his angle of approach shifted by perhaps 10 degrees. His speed decreased fractionally. His ears, which had been pinned back in that aggressive posture associated with prey drive, began to relax. His tail, which had been tucked tightly beneath his body, began to move. And most remarkably of all, his eyes changed. The wild, prey-driven look faded, replaced by something that could only be described as recognition. Duke slid to a stop just 8 feet from Emma, his massive paws kicking up a small cloud of dust. He was still breathing heavily, his body still taut with tension, but he was no longer moving forward. He was no longer an out-of-control animal. He was simply a dog, a very large dog, standing before a very small child, both of them seemingly engaged in a communication that nobody else in the park could quite understand. Officer finally reached Emma, sliding to a stop just behind the child, his hand reaching out to grab her protectively. But Emma didn't move. She was still looking at Duke with that same expression of calm recognition, and Duke was looking back at her. Around them, the park seemed to hold its breath, was still running, but more slowly now, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Parents began to realize that the catastrophe they'd been bracing for was not happening. Instead, something else was unfolding, something inexplicable, something that nobody had anticipated or could quite explain. Duke took one more step forward, but it was different now. It was not the lunge of an attacking animal. It was tentative, almost questioning. And Emma, with the kind of wisdom that seemed impossible from someone so young, reached out her small hand and gently touched the dog's massive head. The contact was brief, lasting only a second or two, but in that moment something shifted in the air, something changed in the energy of the space. The danger that had seemed so imminent, so inevitable, simply evaporated like morning mist beneath the sun. The impossible calm had descended, and nobody in Riverside Park that morning would ever be quite the same. By 2:15 p.m. that Saturday afternoon, less than 4 hours after the incident at Riverside Park, the video had already been viewed 73,000 times on Facebook. By 6:00 p.m., it had been shared across Twitter, Instagram, Tik, and YouTube. By midnight, it had accumulated nearly 2.3 million views. By Sunday morning, it was trending globally. The video itself was just 3 minutes and 47 seconds long, shot on an iPhone by a woman named, a 46-year-old marketing consultant who happened to be at the park that morning with her 2 children and her elderly mother. Had been filming her daughter on the monkey bars when she noticed the commotion. Her first instinct had been to zoom in on the excitement. Like many people, she'd been drawn to the drama of the moment. And in doing so, she had captured something that would become one of the most debated pieces of footage in modern internet history. The video began with the familiar shakiness of phone camera work, the slight blur of motion as panned toward the action. The audio picked up the panic, the screaming parents, the shouting officer, the thundering of the dog's paws. The camera found Duke first, massive and powerful, barreling across the grass. Then it found Emma, tiny and alone, her yellow dress stark against the green of the park. And then, captured in crystal clarity, came the moment. Emma's small voice, high and pure, cut through all the noise. "Hey, Duke. It's okay, you're just scared." The effect on the dog was undeniable. Viewers could see it themselves, frame by frame. The dog's trajectory shifting, the speed decreasing, the ears relaxing, the tail beginning to move. Within seconds, what had appeared to be a charging, aggressive animal transformed into something else entirely, something that looked almost gentle, almost apologetic. Duke came to a stop and Emma reached out her hand. The contact was brief, but when viewers watched it, they felt something in their chests shift. Something they couldn't quite explain. The comments began almost immediately. Thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them. Some people praised the moment as miraculous. "That child is an angel. God sent that little girl to save that dog. This is the thing I've ever seen." Parents across the country found themselves crying as they watched it, moved by something they couldn't quite articulate. The video became a balm, a moment of pure good in a world that often felt dark and complicated. It was shared during family dinners, discussed in church groups, and shown in elementary school classrooms as an example of courage and compassion. But not everyone saw it that way. A significant contingent of social media users began asking questions that grew more pointed and more suspicious as time went on. Why didn't the dog attack? That dog looked aggressive. Is this video real? Something doesn't add up here. Conspiracy theorists began to emerge from the woodwork, proposing increasingly elaborate theories about what had really happened. Some claimed the video was fake, that it had been staged using movie special effects or artificial intelligence. Others suggested that Emma had been specifically trained to handle dogs in this manner, that her parents were animal trainers who had deliberately put her in this situation for publicity. A particularly disturbing theory suggested that the family had somehow abused the dog into submission, that the animal had been conditioned through trauma to respond this way. As these theories gained traction, the tone of the discourse began to shift. News outlets that had initially celebrated the story began to look at it with more skeptical eyes. Journalists who'd been prepared to simply report on the miraculous moment suddenly found themselves asking harder questions. Did Officer really lose control of the dog, or had something else occurred? Was Duke actually an aggressive dog, or had the police department misrepresented the incident? And most disturbingly, what were the real circumstances behind Emma's extraordinary behavior? The Denver Police Department found itself under intense scrutiny. Within 24 hours of the video going viral, they'd released an official statement asserting that Officer had simply experienced an unfortunate lapse in attention, that Duke had escaped accidentally, and that the situation had been resolved without serious injury. They characterized the event as highly unusual, but also incredibly rare, given the extensive training protocols in place. However, critics immediately began digging into the department's records. How many other incidents had there been with the K-9 unit? How thorough was the training? How rigorous were the safety protocols really? Within 48 hours, investigative journalists had uncovered the fact that this was actually the third incident in 5 years involving K-9 unit escapes at Denver area parks. The previous 2 incidents had not been widely publicized, and neither had resulted in serious injuries, but their existence raised troubling questions about whether the department's safety measures were adequate. Social media users began to wonder, what if Emma hadn't been there? What if she hadn't somehow known how to calm the dog? The implications were staggering. Meanwhile, the police department's legal team was having emergency meetings. They knew that Officer's career hung in the balance. They knew that public opinion, which could shift on a dime, was now in serious danger of turning against them. They began preparing defensive statements, gathering documentation of Duke's perfect behavioral record, compiling statistics about the safety of German Shepherds in police work. They were, essentially, preparing for a battle they didn't yet realize was coming. At the same time, social media was constructing an alternate narrative about Emma herself. Some people began to suggest that she possessed some kind of supernatural ability, that she was a dog whisperer, or had some kind of mystical connection to animals. Videos of famous dog trainers and animal behaviorists began to circulate, with people commenting, could Emma have been trained by someone like this? Others claimed to have personal knowledge of Emma or her family, spinning elaborate stories about her background with animals, about supposed training she'd received, about her family's connection to animal rescue organizations. The truth, as is often the case on the internet, became increasingly difficult to discern. The narrative had fractured into 1,000 different versions, each one believed with complete certainty by its adherents. There were those who saw Emma as a hero, those who saw her as a victim, those who saw her as a trained performer in an elaborate hoax, those who saw her as some kind of supernatural being. And underlying all of these narratives was a growing question that nobody could quite answer. What had really happened at Riverside Park? By Monday morning, when checked her email, she found over 300 messages from news outlets, documentarians, book agents, and talk show producers requesting interviews. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from people she didn't know. She'd been forced to turn it off. Her husband had called out of work. They had made an emergency appointment with their family attorney, a woman named Jennifer who specialized in civil rights cases. Had watched the video like everyone else had watched it, and she'd seen something that the general public had missed. She'd seen negligence, and she'd seen an opportunity to force systemic change in how police departments trained and handled their K-9 units. The family had no idea that by the time the week ended, they would be at the center of one of the most significant legal battles in Colorado's recent history. They had no idea that their daughter's extraordinary moment would become the catalyst for change that would ripple across the entire nation. They only knew that their small child had done something inexplicable, and that the world was suddenly very, very interested in understanding exactly what that something was. The letter arrived on Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the incident at Riverside Park. It was printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the official letterhead of an associate's civil rights law. The envelope was addressed to the city of Denver, the Denver Police Department, and officer personally. Inside, in language carefully crafted by one of Colorado's most formidable attorneys, was a notice of intent to file a civil lawsuit seeking damages in excess of $2 million. The city's legal department received the letter at 8:47 a.m., and by 9:15 a.m., emergency meetings were being convened in the offices of the city attorney's office. By 10:00 a.m., insurance companies were being. By noon, the news had leaked to the media, and by 1:00 p.m., it was the lead story on every local Denver news station. What made the lawsuit immediately intriguing to legal observers was not the amount being requested. $2 million was substantial, but not outrageous for a case involving a child and a police dog, but rather the specific nature of the claims being made. Most people expected the family to sue for physical injuries. Emma had sustained only minor scratches, easily treatable and already beginning to fade. But the lawsuit wasn't primarily about physical harm. Instead, it was centered on psychological trauma, emotional distress, negligence in safety protocols, and what called systemic failure of law enforcement training and oversight. It was, in other words, a much more complicated case than the city had anticipated. Jennifer was a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair, piercing blue eyes, and a reputation for being utterly relentless in her pursuit of cases she believed in. She had won settlements against the Denver Police Department twice before, and she had a track record of finding weaknesses in institutional defenses that other attorneys had missed. When she scheduled a press conference for Friday morning, the media showed up in force. She stood at a podium outside the federal courthouse, with them standing slightly behind her, their faces showing the strain of the past 2 weeks. The family is not suing because of any hatred toward officer or the Denver Police Department, began, her voice steady and measured. They are suing because a systemic failure in training, oversight, and safety protocols allowed a dangerous situation to develop. And more importantly, they are suing because the psychological trauma inflicted on their daughter by this incident is real, profound, and ongoing. We have documentation from child psychologists and trauma specialists confirming that Emma is experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. She has nightmares. She experiences panic attacks when she hears loud noises. She has developed an irrational fear of the park where she used to play freely. These are not minor concerns. These are serious, documented psychological injuries that will require ongoing treatment. The media frenzy that followed the press conference was immediate and intense. News outlets began interviewing child psychologists about trauma in young children. They began looking more deeply into the K-9 unit's history. They began questioning whether police dog training protocols were adequate. Within 48 hours, it became clear that the family's lawsuit was going to be a significant legal event, potentially with implications far beyond Denver. The Denver Police Department's response came through their legal representatives, a team of experienced municipal defense attorneys led by a firm called and Associates. Their statement was carefully worded but firm. The incident at Riverside Park was an unfortunate accident resulting from a momentary lapse by officer. However, it is important to note that no serious injury occurred. The dog was recovered and restrained within seconds. Officer has an exemplary record spanning 17 years of service. The department has comprehensive training protocols that exceed national standards, and we believe this case is without merit. However, what the city didn't know, what nobody knew except for a small team of investigators working for Jennifer, was that she had already begun uncovering information that would fundamentally change the nature of the case. Her investigators had interviewed other K-9 handlers in the department. They had reviewed historical records. They had analyzed training videos and protocols. And what they had discovered was damning. The Denver Police Department's K-9 unit training procedures were, in many respects, outdated. They were relying on methods that had been superseded by more modern, science-based approaches to animal behavior and handler training. Moreover, the 3 incidents involving K-9 unit escapes in 5 years suggested a pattern, not an anomaly. But there was something else, something that made eyes light up when she first learned about it. During her initial consultation with the family, she had asked Emma a series of gentle questions about what happened. The child had given answers that, on their surface, seemed like typical toddler responses, simple, somewhat disconnected, not particularly illuminating. But when played the video of these responses to a child psychologist colleague, the expert had noticed something remarkable. Emma had used specific language about the dog's emotional state. She had described Duke as being scared and confused. She had used phrases like, "He didn't know what to do." These were not typical ways for a 3-year-old to describe an animal, unless that child had some kind of unusual ability to perceive and interpret animal behavior and emotions. This observation led down a new investigative path. She began researching child development, animal behavior, and the rare phenomenon of children who seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of animals. She reached out to leading researchers in the field. She commissioned psychological evaluations and behavioral assessments, and slowly, a new narrative began to emerge, one that was far more complex and interesting than a simple case of police negligence. The case was beginning to take on dimensions that nobody had anticipated. It wasn't just about whether the police department had been negligent, though they clearly had been. It was also about something much more fundamental. What was the nature of Emma's extraordinary ability? How had a 3-year-old child managed to do something that professional animal handlers couldn't do? And if she could do it, what did that suggest about the nature of animal behavior, human-animal communication, and the possibility that there were approaches to handling animals that police departments weren't currently employing? The implications were staggering. If could demonstrate that Emma's actions had prevented what could have been a serious injury or death, then she could argue that the department's failure to employ more sophisticated understanding of animal behavior had created unnecessary danger. She could argue that modern approaches to animal training and handling, approaches that paid attention to an animal's emotional state rather than just its conditioned responses, were not only more humane but potentially more effective and safer. By the time the case officially went to court 3 months later, it was no longer just another lawsuit. It had become something much larger, a referendum on how police departments train their K-9 units, on what science understood about animal behavior, and on the remarkable capabilities of a small child whose inexplicable gift had forced the legal system to confront uncomfortable questions about everything it thought it knew about dogs, training, and the nature of human-animal communication. The family had come to Jennifer expecting a straightforward case. What they got instead was something far more significant, the opportunity to change an entire system, backed by a lawyer who saw the potential and was willing to fight relentlessly to bring that change to reality. The morning of January 13th dawned gray and cold over Denver, the kind of winter morning where the sky seems to press down on the earth with an almost physical weight. Snow had fallen during the night, just enough to coat the streets and sidewalks with a thin layer of white that crunched beneath people's feet. Outside the federal courthouse on Champa Street, a crowd had begun to gather as early as 6:00 a.m. News vans from every major Denver station had claimed their spots on the street. Camera operators were setting up their equipment, testing microphones, adjusting angles. This was not just another lawsuit. It had become something approaching a cultural event, a moment when the legal system would be forced to confront questions about police training, animal behavior, and the nature of a child's extraordinary gift. Inside the courthouse, in the offices of Judge, final preparations were. Judge was a woman known for running a tight ship, for demanding rigorous adherence to procedure, and for having no tolerance for theatrics or grandstanding. She had reviewed all the filings from both sides and had expressed some skepticism about the case in her preliminary rulings. The city's legal team was feeling cautiously optimistic. This was exactly the kind of judge they wanted, one who would focus on legal precedent and established procedures, rather than being swayed by emotional appeals or media narratives. At 8:45 a.m., the courtroom began to fill. The gallery, the public seating area, was packed within minutes, with media representatives occupying the front row and a diverse group of observers filling the remaining seats. There were animal behaviorists who had come to witness the proceedings. There were police officers curious about how their department would be represented. There were ordinary citizens who simply wanted to see the little girl who had calmed the police dog. Security was tight, with courthouse marshals ensuring that everyone passed through metal detectors and had their belongings scanned. When it entered the courtroom at 9:15 a.m., accompanied by Jennifer and her legal team, the gallery fell silent. Wore a dark gray blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, was in a navy suit. They both looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of stress and uncertainty. Behind them, walking between two court-appointed child advocates, was Emma. She wore a simple pink dress, white socks, and small black shoes. She looked even smaller in the formal setting of the courthouse than she had in that open field at the park. The opposing counsel entered from a different door, led by Charles, no relation to the judge, a senior partner at and associates who had defended the city in numerous cases over his 30-year career. With him were two associate attorneys and a representative from the city attorney's office. They moved with the kind of confident, practiced ease that comes from having successfully defended institutional clients against numerous legal challenges. They settled into their positions at the defense table, arranging documents and opening laptops with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Judge entered from her chambers at 9:30 a.m. precisely, and everyone rose. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray streaks in her dark hair, reading glasses hanging around her neck, and an expression that suggested she had seen every variation of human behavior that a courtroom could produce, and was not particularly impressed by any of it. She settled into her chair and began with the standard judicial recitations about the nature of the proceedings, the importance of truthfulness, and the obligations of everyone present to maintain the dignity of the court. "This is a civil case," Judge began, her voice steady and measured. "V. City of Denver and Denver Police Department. The burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence, that is, whether the evidence presented by the plaintiff is more likely than not to be true. I will be applying established legal standards to whatever facts the evidence presents. I want to be clear. This courtroom is not a venue for spectacle or emotion. We are here to determine the facts, to apply law, and to render a decision based on both. Is that understood by all counsel?" Both teams nodded their agreement. The trial was officially. The first 2 days were consumed by what legal professionals called opening statements, essentially, each side telling the jury their version of the story, before any actual evidence was presented. Jennifer delivered her opening statement on the afternoon of the first day, after Charles had finished outlining the defense's position. Stood before the jury with a presence that seemed to fill the entire courtroom, her voice carrying both authority and emotion, without veering into anything that could be labeled as theatricality. "What you will hear in this courtroom over the next 3 weeks," began, "is a story about negligence. Not intentional wrongdoing, but negligence. A failure to meet the standard of care that the Denver Police Department was obligated to meet. You will hear evidence that the K-9 unit's training protocols were outdated. You will hear from experts that the safety measures in place were inadequate. And most importantly, you will see for yourselves the evidence of the trauma inflicted on a 3-year-old child when those protocols failed." She paused, letting the words settle. "But there is something else you will learn in this courtroom," continued. "You will learn about a child who, through either instinct or training or some combination of both, managed to do what a professional police handler could not do. You will learn what that tells us about animal behavior, about police training, and about where this department has failed not just one family, but potentially thousands of officers and animals across the country." The defense's opening was more measured, more focused on procedural issues and the rarity of the incident. Charles emphasized Duke's perfect record, officer's 17 years of experience, and the statistical improbability of handler error. He suggested that what had happened was extraordinary precisely because it was so unusual, not because the department's procedures were inadequate. The first week of the trial was devoted to establishing basic facts. Witnesses about the incident, park visitors who had been present, police officers who had responded, emergency medical personnel who had treated Emma. The city attempted to establish that the incident had been resolved quickly and that no serious injury had occurred. Countered by calling child psychologists who about the various forms trauma could take, particularly in young children, and how psychological injuries were just as real and damaging as physical ones. By the end of the first week, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm. Witnesses were called, questioned by both sides, and excused. Documents were entered into evidence. The jury began to understand the basic framework of the dispute, but everyone knew that the real substance of the case had not yet begun. Everyone was waiting for the expert witnesses, particularly the animal behaviorists. And everyone was waiting for Emma herself to take the stand, though that moment wouldn't come until the second week, when the courtroom's attention would reach fever pitch, and the entire narrative of the case would shift in ways that nobody could have anticipated. As the first week concluded and the courtroom emptied on Friday afternoon, Judge remained on the bench, reviewing her notes. She had been a judge for 23 years, and she had a sense for cases, a kind of intuition about which ones would become turning points in the legal system. This case had that quality. Something about it felt larger than its surface details. Something about it suggested that what happened in this courtroom over the next 2 weeks would have implications that extended far beyond the family and the Denver Police Department. Tuesday morning of the second week arrived with a heaviness that seemed to permeate the federal courthouse. Everyone knew what was coming. For the past 5 days, witnesses had about the incident, about training procedures, about police protocols. Expert witnesses had been called, veterinary behaviorists, police training specialists, psychologists who documented Emma's trauma. But none of it mattered, not really. Everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the jury to the packed gallery to the media representatives with their cameras ready, knew that the pivotal moment was approaching. Emma would take the stand at 10:00 a.m. The preparation had been meticulous. Jennifer had spent hours with Emma in a specially designed room at her law office, working through the questions that would be asked, helping the child understand what would happen in the courtroom, assuring her that she was safe and protected. A court psychologist had been consulted to ensure that the questioning would not be unduly traumatic. A special elevated witness chair had been arranged, something that would allow Emma to be seen by the jury while also making her less intimidated by the size of the courtroom. Everything had been done to make the experience as bearable as possible for a 4-year-old child. At 9:55 a.m., Emma was brought into the courtroom through a side entrance, accompanied by 2 child advocates and a court psychologist. The gallery fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The little girl in the pink dress walked carefully across the courtroom floor, her small hand holding onto the psychologist's hand. She looked simultaneously fragile and composed, almost eerily aware of the significance of the moment. When she was helped into the elevated witness chair, she sat perched like a small bird, her feet not touching the ground, her eyes wide as she looked out at the sea of faces before her. Judge spoke to Emma with surprising gentleness, her typically stern demeanor softening as she explained what would happen. She asked Emma if she understood the importance of telling the truth. Emma nodded. She asked if Emma would promise to tell the truth. Emma said, in a voice barely audible to those in the back of the courtroom, "Yes, I promise." The prosecution's attorney, a woman named Sarah, no relation to Officer, approached the witness stand with careful, measured steps. Her questioning was designed to be gentle but thorough, to establish the traumatic nature of the incident without being accusatory or leading. She asked Emma to describe the day at the park. Emma provided simple answers in a child's language, describing the butterflies she had been chasing, the feeling of being picked up by her mother, the sound of people shouting. "Were you scared, Emma?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Emma said. "Everyone was scared." "Why do you think everyone was scared?" Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about the question. When she spoke, her words seemed to hang in the air of the courtroom like something fragile and precious. "Because Duke was coming really fast and they thought he was going to hurt me." "Were you scared that Duke was going to hurt you?" Emma shook her head. "No, I was scared because everyone else was scared. Duke wasn't trying to hurt me, he was just confused." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge raised her gavel, and the murmur died instantly. Sarah pressed further. "How did you know Duke was confused?" "I could see it," Emma said simply. "When something is scared or confused, you can see it in their eyes and the way their body moves. Duke's eyes were big and worried, and his body was all tight. He didn't know what to do." More murmuring. The judge raised her gavel again. Sarah finished her questioning with a few more gentle inquiries about Emma's emotional state after the incident, and then she stepped aside. Now it was time for the cross-examination, the defense attorney's opportunity to question the child and potentially to suggest that her testimony was not reliable or had been coached by her parents and their attorney. Charles, the defense's lead counsel, stood up slowly. He was a tall man with gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested decades of courtroom experience. He approached the witness stand, but he did so with caution, clearly aware that the jury was watching his every move, alert for any sign that he might be bullying a child. His first questions were innocuous, designed simply to establish rapport and make Emma feel comfortable. "Emma, have you ever been around dogs before?" he asked. "Yes," Emma said. "We have a dog at home. His name is Max. He's a golden retriever. He's really nice. I love him." "Do you like dogs?" "Yes, I like most animals. I have a hamster too." Nodded, continuing in this vein for several minutes, asking Emma about her pets, about animals she had seen, about her general experiences with animals. The defense team's strategy was becoming clear. They were going to attempt to establish that Emma had prior experience with dogs, that her calm behavior was perhaps not so extraordinary after all, that it could be explained by the fact that she was simply familiar with animals. But then Jennifer's cross-examination strategy, which she had drilled into Emma during their practice sessions, came into play. Asked, almost casually, "When you saw Duke that day at the park, what did you do?" "I talked to him," Emma said. "What did you say to him?" "I told him it was okay and that he was just scared." "How did you know to say that?" Emma paused, and in that pause the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. When she spoke, her answer was devastatingly simple and profound. Because I could feel what he was feeling. When you know what someone feels, even if it's a dog, you know how to help them feel better. The courtroom erupted in reaction. People leaned forward in their seats. Reporters scribbled frantically. Even Judge seemed momentarily caught off guard. She raised her gavel and called for order, but the damage was done. Emma's words hung in the air, and suddenly the case had shifted from being about police negligence and procedures to being about something much more fundamental, a child's remarkable intuitive understanding of animal emotion. Pressed on, attempting to recover ground. He asked if Emma had been coached about what to say. He asked if anyone had told her what to say to Duke. Emma firmly this, her answers becoming more articulate and confident as the questioning continued. She was not being evasive or clever, she was simply being truthful. She had done what she had done because something in her, some combination of instinct, intuition, and empathetic understanding, had told her what Duke needed. When finally released Emma from cross-examination, nearly an hour had passed. The child was carefully escorted from the courtroom, past the sympathetic faces of jurors and observers. As she left, several people in the gallery were visibly emotional, some even wiping away tears. Judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway. Media representatives rushed to their cameras to file reports. Legal analysts began discussing what Emma's testimony meant for the case. And in the counsel's conference room, the defense team faced the uncomfortable reality that their carefully constructed procedural defense had just been bulldozed by a 4-year-old's articulate description of what had actually happened. Jennifer sat at the counsel table with a satisfied expression. She had known that Emma's testimony would be powerful. What she hadn't anticipated was just how profoundly it would shift the entire nature of the case. Emma hadn't just about her experience. She had articulated a fundamental truth about the nature of her gift, about her ability to perceive and respond to animal emotion in ways that transcended training or coaching. The real battle, was just beginning, and everything that followed would be shaped by what that small child had just said from the witness stand. The recess lasted for 30 minutes, but it felt like an eternity compressed into half an hour. Court officers were stationed at the doors, preventing casual conversation between opposing counsel. Media representatives huddled in the hallway, breaking down Emma's testimony with various legal experts and animal behaviorists. Inside the courthouse, in a small conference room, Charles and his legal team sat in stunned silence, reassessing their entire strategy. What had seemed like a straightforward defense of standard police procedures had just become something far more complicated and far more threatening to their position. When court reconvened at 11:30 a.m., Jennifer made a strategic move that caught the defense completely off guard. Rather than calling additional witnesses to testify about the incident or police procedures, she called her first expert witness, Dr. David, no relation to either judge or defense counsel Charles, from the National K-9 Association, and a prominent veterinary behaviorist with over 20 years of professional experience. The defense had been expecting this testimony eventually, but they hadn't expected it quite yet, not immediately following Emma's direct testimony while her words were still fresh in everyone's minds. Dr. David was a man in his late 60s with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of bearing that suggested someone who had spent decades in academic and professional pursuits. He carried with him a slim leather portfolio and wore the uniform of the professional expert, dark suit, conservative tie, an air of quiet authority. After he was sworn in and the basic preliminaries were established, Jennifer began her questioning with deliberate precision. Doctor, in your professional experience, is it unusual for a small child to remain calm in the presence of an agitated or distressed dog? It is extraordinarily unusual, Doctor replied, his voice measured and authoritative. Most children exhibit fear responses in such situations. Some freeze, some run, some scream. The combination of remaining calm and then employing de-escalation techniques is extremely rare in adults, let alone in a 3-year-old child. Is such calmness something that can be trained into a child? In my professional opinion, not to the degree we witnessed in this case. Training can help, certainly. But what we observed in the video of this incident appears to be something more fundamental, an intuitive understanding of animal behavior and animal emotion that transcends conventional training. Then did something remarkable. She had video technicians wheel in a large monitor, and she played the viral video of the incident in slow motion, frame by frame. As the video played, Doctor provided real-time commentary on what was happening from a behavioral perspective. "You can see here," said, pointing at the screen, "the dog's body language is consistent with a high state of arousal. The ears are pinned back, the eyes are wide, the tail is tucked. These are clear signs of distress or aggression. The dog is moving at high speed toward the child. Any reasonable person would expect a negative outcome." The video continued, showing Emma standing still, then speaking, then reaching out her hand. "And here," continued, "observe the dog's response to the child's voice and presence. The ears begin to relax. The body posture changes. The tail, which was tucked, begins to move. The eyes, which were wide and dilated, begin to normalize. This transformation took place over approximately 8 to 10 seconds, an extraordinarily rapid shift in emotional state." He paused, removing his glasses to clean them on his jacket, a gesture that allowed the significance of what he had just described to settle in the minds of the jurors. "What is particularly remarkable," said, replacing his glasses, "is that this shift appears to have been caused directly by the child's calm presence and her words. The officer was shouting commands that the dog completely ignored. The child spoke softly, and the dog responded. From a behavioral perspective, this suggests that the child was employing what we call intuitive de-escalation, an instinctive understanding of what the animal needed in that moment." The defense's cross-examination of Doctor was vigorous but ultimately ineffective. When Charles attempted to suggest that Duke's shift in behavior might have been coincidental or caused by something other than Emma's intervention, Doctor politely but firmly rejected the suggestion. "The timing is too precise," the expert stated. "The dog's response correlated directly with the child's verbal and physical presence. In my professional experience, I have never seen a dog in such a high state of arousal respond so dramatically to a child's intervention. It is, frankly, unprecedented in my experience." But Doctor was only the beginning. Over the next 2 days, called a succession of expert witnesses who each provided pieces of the puzzle. Dr. Reeves, a child psychologist specializing in trauma and extraordinary abilities in children, about Emma's developmental profile and the remarkable perceptiveness she displayed. She described Emma not as a normal 3-year-old, but as a child with exceptional abilities in reading and responding to emotional states. "In my clinical assessment," Dr. Reeves, "Emma displays what we might call high perceptual sensitivity. She is capable of detecting microexpressions and subtle body language cues that most people, even most adults, completely miss. Combined with her lack of fear or preconceived notions about how animals should behave, this allows her to respond intuitively to what an animal is actually experiencing, rather than to what she has been trained to expect." A veterinary neuroscientist named Dr. James about the neurobiology of animal emotion and the ways that certain individuals seem to have enhanced abilities to read and interpret animal behavior. He presented research suggesting that such abilities might be partially genetic, partially neurological, and partially developed through early exposure and experience. Most devastatingly, a retired K-9 unit commander named Captain Samuel, again, no relation to the plaintiff family, about the inadequacies of current police dog training protocols. He stated, with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years in law enforcement, that modern approaches to animal behavior science were were significantly more sophisticated than what the Denver Police Department was currently employing. The department's training methods, Captain said bluntly, are based on conditioning and command response. What we're learning through modern behavioral science is that understanding the animal's emotional and mental state is equally, if not more, important. This child intuitively understood something that took me decades to learn through formal training. That suggests that our entire approach to police dog training may need to be reconsidered. By the time finished presenting her expert witnesses on Thursday afternoon, the landscape of the case had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer primarily about police negligence, though that remained part of the argument. It had become, instead, about something far more significant: the nature of human-animal communication, the inadequacy of current police training protocols in light of modern behavioral science, and the extraordinary abilities of one child that had inadvertently revealed how much the profession didn't know about the animals it worked with every day. The defense's expert witnesses, when they finally took the stand on Friday, seemed almost defensive by comparison. That Duke's escape was statistically rare, that officer's record was exemplary, that the incident was an unfortunate accident rather than evidence of systemic failure. But their testimony carried little weight in the face of what had come before. The jury had already heard from the child herself, had watched the video analyzed frame by frame, and had listened to multiple experts explain what they had witnessed. The defense was attempting to put the genie back in the bottle, but the genie had already escaped, and there was no way to contain it again. Judge watched all of this with an expression that revealed nothing, her years of judicial experience allowing her to maintain perfect neutrality, even as she clearly understood the significance of what was unfolding in her courtroom. She had presided over hundreds of trials, but few had possessed the combination of compelling narrative, expert testimony, and genuine legal significance that characterized this case. And she understood, as everyone in the courtroom understood, that the outcome now seemed almost inevitable. The jury deliberation room on the fourth floor of the federal courthouse was a windowless space painted in institutional beige, furnished with a long wooden table, 12 chairs, and the weight of responsibility that came with trying to render justice in a complicated case. The jury had been sequestered for 2 days following the conclusion of arguments. Jennifer had delivered a closing statement that wove together the threads of Emma's testimony, the expert analysis, and the video evidence into a narrative that was both legally compelling and emotionally resonant. Charles had countered with a defense focused on the rarity of the incident and the city's good faith efforts to maintain safety protocols. Now in the jury room, 12 ordinary people from Denver, a teacher, a nurse, a small business owner, a retired engineer, a graphic designer, a construction worker, and 7 others, grappled with the central questions of the case. Was the Denver Police Department negligent? If so, to what degree? And what was a reasonable monetary award for the psychological trauma inflicted on a child, particularly when that trauma had been prevented from being far worse by the child's own extraordinary intervention? The deliberations lasted longer than anyone expected. The jury foreman, a woman named who worked as a respiratory therapist at Denver Medical Center, later described the process as emotionally exhausting. The jurors had to wrestle not just with legal questions, but with the deeper implications of what they had witnessed. They watched the video again and again. They discussed Emma's testimony, replaying her words in their minds. They debated the significance of the expert testimony. And they struggled with a question that went beyond the legal framework of negligence. Did the city owe a greater debt to this family because a child had possessed an extraordinary gift that saved her from serious injury? By late Wednesday afternoon, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was called to order at 4:15 p.m. The atmosphere was tense, pregnant with anticipation, and sat at the counsel table with Jennifer. The city's legal team occupied their positions at the defense table, Judge entered, her face revealing nothing. The jury filed in, taking their seats in the jury box. Everyone stood when instructed to do so. On the question of whether the Denver Police Department was negligent in its maintenance of K-9 unit safety protocols, the jury foreman read, her voice steady and clear, "We find in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant was negligent." A collective breath seemed to exhale throughout the courtroom. This was the critical finding. Everything else flowed from this determination. On the question of monetary damages for pain and suffering, emotional distress, and psychological trauma, the foreman continued, "We award the plaintiff the sum of $850,000. The number hung in the air for a moment before registering fully. $850,000, more than the city's insurance had anticipated, but less than had requested. It was, in the language of civil litigation, a split-the-difference verdict that suggested the jury had believed the plaintiff's case, but had some reservations about the full scope of damages claimed. Grabb's hand, tears streaming down her face. Around them, observers in the gallery reacted with quiet emotion. The defense team sat stone-faced, already running calculations about appeals and next steps. Judge thanked the jury for their service and outlined the process for post-trial motions and potential appeals. But the monetary award, significant as it was, would prove to be only one dimension of the verdict's impact. Far more significant were the conditions attached to the settlement agreement that Jennifer and Charles negotiated over the following weeks. The city agreed to more than just paying damages. They agreed to establish what would become known as the Emma K-9 Safety Initiative, a comprehensive, science-based retraining program for all K-9 handlers in Colorado. The initiative included several key components. First, K-9 handlers would receive training in modern animal behavior science, moving beyond simple command conditioning to include education about animal emotional states and psychological needs. Second, new safety protocols would be implemented, including electronic backup leashing systems and mandatory breaks to assess both handler and animal stress levels. Third, K-9 units would be evaluated not just on their performance in drug detection, but on their overall behavioral and psychological well-being. Fourth, the program would incorporate elements of what experts called intuitive handling, training handlers to pay attention to the subtle signals that animals were communicating, much as Emma had instinctively done. Within 2 years, the Emma K-9 Safety Initiative had become a model that other police departments across the country were beginning to adopt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation sent representatives to Denver to study the program. The Department of Homeland Security expressed interest in incorporating elements of it into their own K-9 training protocols. What had begun as a local lawsuit in Denver had become the catalyst for a national conversation about animal behavior, police training, and the intersection of intuition and science. But the real story, the story that mattered most, was what happened to Emma herself. As Emma grew older, her remarkable gift for understanding animals became increasingly apparent. By age 7, she was consulting informally with animal behaviorists at the Denver Zoo. By age 10, she had worked with trainers at a local animal sanctuary to develop techniques for calming traumatized animals. By age 14, she had founded Bridge Between Species, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting humane approaches to animal training and behavior understanding. The organization started small, just Emma, her parents, and a handful of dedicated volunteers working out of a rented storefront in a strip mall in Denver. But the idea caught fire. Parents who heard Emma's story wanted her to teach their children how to understand animals better. Schools began inviting her to speak about animal behavior. Veterinarians and animal trainers started reaching out, wanting to learn from her insights. By age 18, Emma had published her first book, Speaking Their Language, Understanding Animal Emotion and Behavior, which became a surprise bestseller, adopted by over 200 universities and veterinary schools across North America. She gave lectures at major universities. She consulted with animal rescue organizations. She appeared on national television programs, discussing the importance of understanding animal emotion and the ethical implications of how humans trained and used animals in law enforcement and other capacities. More remarkably, Emma's work began to influence police training nationwide. Officers and K-9 handlers who read her books or attended her lectures reported that their understanding of their dogs had transformed. They began to see their animals not as tools or machines, but as sentient beings with emotions, fears, and needs that deserved to be respected and understood. Police departments that had previously focused solely on obedience and performance began to incorporate animal welfare concerns into their training protocols. At age 25, Emma was invited to testify before Congress about the importance of modern animal behavior science in law enforcement. At age 30, she had expanded Bridge Between Species into an international organization with chapters in 17 countries. At age 35, she received the prestigious Newton Prize for Innovation in Animal Welfare, presented alongside scientists and activists who had spent entire careers in the field. But perhaps the most significant moment came on a cold February afternoon in 2035, when Emma, now a recognized authority in animal behavior science with multiple advanced degrees and decades of consulting experience, returned to Riverside Park in Denver. Officer, long since retired from the police force, met her there. Had struggled with guilt over the incident for years, feeling that his momentary lapse had endangered a child. But he had also followed Emma's career with fascination and pride, watching as the child he had inadvertently harmed had gone on to transform the field he had worked in his entire life. They stood together near the spot where the incident had occurred, looking out at the park where children played and people walked their dogs that were being handled. Emma noticed with satisfaction, with a sensitivity to animal behavior that was far greater than what had been standard practice just 30 years earlier. "I've thought about this moment so many times," said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've wondered if I ever had a chance to apologize, if I could explain how sorry I was." Emma took his hand gently, much as she had touched Duke's head all those years ago. "There's nothing to apologize for," she said. "Your mistake led to something beautiful. It led to change. It led to a way of thinking about animals that honors what they are. If that moment at Riverside Park hadn't happened, none of this would exist." She gestured toward the park, toward the world that had been shaped by the ripple effects of one child's extraordinary gift, one police dog's escape, and a moment that had seemed catastrophic but had instead become transformative. "Everything that's happened," Emma continued, "came from that day. My purpose, my work, the lives we've touched, all of it came from that moment when Duke and I met, and he needed me to understand him. Sometimes the most important changes come from the most unexpected places." Judge, long since retired, read about the gathering at Riverside Park in a newspaper article and smiled to herself. She had known, sitting in her courtroom nearly 30 years earlier, that something significant was unfolding. But even she had not anticipated just how far-reaching the consequences would be. A child's intuitive gift, validated by a legal system that had been forced to take it seriously, had rippled outward in ways that touched the lives of millions of animals and the people who worked with them. It was, she thought, a perfect example of how justice sometimes takes forms that nobody anticipates, and how the most powerful transformations often come not from grand plans, but from the unexpected intersection of circumstance, capability, and courage.